my reading of this latest strategy is to put equal emphasis on building strength in the homeland and deterring China. But some critics view this approach as being soft on China. So what's your take on the latest report when it comes to deterring the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, these reports usually leave most people a little bit unhappy. They don't get what they want. They don't see the language they want. They think the priorities go somewhere else. But if you read it closely, what it's calling for is dealing with China from a position of strength and taking on China out in the so-called First Island chain. That's the Western Pacific, from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines and down to Malaysia. And it is ultimately saying, look, we want to get along with China. We want a decent peace with them. But we are going to deal with them from a position of strength, and we're going to have a military that can do it. But as importantly, we're going to have a defense industrial base. We're going to have an economy that can take on China, get away from these dependencies. So it doesn't say a few things that it might have. It doesn't mention Taiwan, for example. It doesn't mention that China is conducting political warfare beyond the First Island chain all the way to Latin America. But it does get the basics right.
Now, this plan emphasizes what it says matters most to Americans, and this includes security, freedom, and prosperity. But to achieve those goals, the document says it requires building up American defenses and neutralizing threats. So what is President Trump's strategy for seeking respectful relations with China while keeping a clear eye on its goals toward global dominance?
Well, that's one of the sort of the paradoxes of this, and it may be unsolvable, is that the report talks about having a decent peace, not strangling, not humiliating China, not seeking regime change, and really to reach a peace that China can live with in the Asia Pacific and elsewhere. But the problem is that while the Americans may want that and think it's reasonable, well, that's not China's objective. China's objective is to dominate and ultimately to drive us out of the Asia-Pacific region, for starters. But the idea is to offer China a deal, and if they don't take it, we're going to be ready to deal with them if necessary. It talks about strength without confrontation, but to the Chinese, anytime one shows strength or an effort to defend themselves, that is confrontation from their perspective. So I'm not sure exactly how this can work out. But some of the language in the NDS is a little bit too conciliatory, in my opinion, and it does talk about restarting or having solid military-to-military engagement and communications with the Chinese, and that has been tried for a long, long time, and it really hasn't produced anything of use. The Chinese understand us, and they understand what we're trying to do, and the idea that somehow they just don't understand America, I think that's missing the boat. But in some ways, an American conceit that if people just talk to us, they might come to like us. But that said, the basics of this report are pretty good, in my opinion.
Now, speaking of things that have been tried for a long, long time, Air and Space Forces magazine reports that past presidents made efforts to pivot their focus from Europe and the Middle East to China. Now, how were their strategies toward China different from what Trump is doing now?
Well, the Obama administration, they're the ones who started the pivot. And that was really just a way to distinguish themselves from George Bush and his so-called forever wars in the Middle East. There was actually no substance at all to the pivot. The Obama administration proved to be extremely weak when it came to dealing with China. The Biden administration was slightly better, but at the same time, it didn't really push China very much or nearly as much as it should have. You remember the dressing down Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and Kurt Campbell took in Anchorage, Alaska, when Chinese diplomats lectured them fiercely for half an hour, and they just sat there and took it. And that kind of typified the fundamental Biden administration approach, although they did do some good things when it came to trade restrictions, etc. But the Trump administration is one that understands the China threat very well. You saw how the first Trump administration dealt with China. It was the first one ever to take on China with any sort of backbone. This time around, they're doing it a little bit differently, but there is an effort to say, do things China doesn't like. And that includes building up the military. You saw President Trump talk about the Golden Fleet. It's not mentioned in the report, unfortunately. And there is some talk of actually rebuilding the U.S. Navy, having a strong military, but also getting to the revitalization of America's industrial base, which is essential, and the importance of the economic strength when it comes to dealing with China. And if President Trump could, I think we'd have seen a much stronger approach taken to China. But the Chinese are playing their rare earth chokehold that they've got over U.S. industry and other dependencies, such as pharmaceuticals. And that has really forced Mr. Trump to back off more than he would like. But he is, I say, once again, he's doing things that China doesn't like. And for one thing, for example, he's also talking about America's allies having to do more for their own defense. China does not want to see America with capable allies who are able to operate with us and who are able to defend themselves. So he, as I say, he's carrying on from his first term, doing it a little bit differently. And a couple other things. He's gone after Venezuela. He's gone after Iran. If he goes after Cuba, these are things which really hurt and embarrass the People's Republic of China.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this plan doesn't mention Taiwan, but it does appear to have a plan to build military strength in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, that region includes Taiwan, which China views as its own. But the strategy doesn't mention Taiwan, as we said. So why not explicitly include Taiwan in this plan?
Well, I think, and what I hear is that there's an effort to not say anything verbally that China isn't going to like. And I think that's probably mistaken, but that does seem to be the strategy the administration is taking. Taiwan isn't mentioned. It would have been good if they did, but at the same time, look at what the Americans are actually doing in the region. Look at the support they are giving to Taiwan, the presence of American advisors and trainers there, approving an $11 billion arms deal to Taiwan recently. It would be good, of course, if they could deliver these sometime before the end of this century. But nonetheless, they are doing things. And so the language in these reports says it always gets people riled up, but it's probably not appropriate in this case. But as I also mentioned, there is no mention of political warfare. There's no mention of the Central Pacific. So while the focus is on defending kinetically with armed force along the First Island chain, the Chinese are already well ensconced in every Pacific island, behind the First Island chain, and all the way to Latin America. For now, it's political warfare, but it's undercutting America's position in the region. And if you don't get that right or pay attention to it, then you just might find yourself beefed up on the First Island chain, but your rear area has gone to pieces as the Chinese are there and have undercut our presence there and have built up dual-use infrastructure, ports, airfields, and also have subverted local governments so that the PLA can actually come in there and operate. So that perhaps should have gotten a mention. Additionally, one notes that while there's talk of defending the homeland, that Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas out in the Pacific, these are American people. And that rarely gets considered, but that should have been paid attention to as well. So there were some things that one hopes that somebody's thinking about, but I'm not entirely certain of that. And if you don't mention it, sometimes you'll find that, say, a military, say U.S. Indo-PACOM, well, if somebody tries to get someone to pay attention to the Central Pacific, the rear areas, and also political warfare, you could find an officer saying, well, where's it mentioned in the National Defense Strategy? It's not. What is mentioned? The First Island chain. So you may find an overfocus on the First Island chain if you're not careful.
Well, perhaps he's following that old adage, action speaks louder than words.